take this opportunity. I want to thank the Ottawa Chamber of Commerce and the Legislative Action Committee, Franklin County Farm Bureau Association, American Legion Post number 60. We want to thank the City of Ottawa for their coffee and broadcasting this live on the Government Access Channel. And you held up a 2. I'm not sure what that means, but that's the other Richard in the world. In case you didn't know, there's two Richards. That's another story. We want to thank the Franklin County Farm Bureau for providing the refreshments. You might notice that the refreshments are a little bit different than what we've had in the past with the rolls, donuts, and all of that stuff that we probably shouldn't be eating. Actually, this is a little bit more wholesome. But we all remember Gene Ramsey, which was a long-term member of the Legislative Action Committee and past mayor and actively involved in the community. And so this is our way of paying a little tribute to Gene. As you all know, he passed away back in October. Ann is here, and Marcy. So one of the things that Gene liked was chocolate chip cookies and animal crackers and lemonade. So we have chocolate chip cookies, animal crackers, lemonade, and lemon drops. Now, somebody says, now you're trying to politicize that. Because everybody knows that Gene was a Democrat. And Gene would admit to it that he was a Democrat. So, we do have a donkey. All right? We do have a donkey. And Blaine, we didn't leave the other side out. We have an elephant. So there's an elephant and there's a donkey. So everybody's covered. Everybody's covered back there. Okay. We had a sheet that was passed out. It has some questions on there that you can look at those. Those are questions. If you can't think of a question to ask, I'm sure that there's plenty of questions you have out there that you want to ask. Now, we have a few game rules here, and they're really very simple. Where's Lewis Reed is going to have the mic. And so somebody has a question to raise their hand, and Lewis will walk over, but you don't get the mic. Because if you get the mic, you never give it back. So make sure that you have a question, one question, no A and B part questions, because we want to try and we have actually got a smaller group than I thought that we would. So I think we've got enough time that everybody could ask a question if they want. And so I think those are the rules, and as mentioned, is being broadcast on the Access channel. So kind of watch your behavior and keep yourselves in check. And let's be mindful of each other and be respectful. And I know the legislators, they sit up there, and if you've ever been an elected official, you know that everybody that comes to the meeting is not happy with you. And sometimes they tell you, no matter what you can understand. But we can be respectful on the questions that we asked, and they've taken their time out to respond, and it's also an opportunity for them to learn from us. So why don't we start out with maybe about a five-minute overview from our legislators on what's taken place so far. And I might introduce them. At far right is Representative Kevin Jones, Senator Tyson in the middle, and Representative Finch. And we probably ought to, I guess, seniority, legislative-wide, and let their senator go first.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. I know it's not always to give up your Saturday morning to come. I would like to convey my respects to Gene Ramsey and his family. He was our friend. You know, we may not have always agreed, but he did always bring a smile to my face whenever I saw him and gave me a nice hug. So I appreciated Gene very much. And he was a big part of this community and noticeably will be missed. So thank you. As far as the legislature goes, we've started off to a little bit slower start this session. Kansas is on a 2-year bill cycle. Bills that were introduced last year, if they did not die in committee or weren't killed on the floor, they're still in play. So we have bills below the line that leadership could have brought to the floor. They're giving us a little bit of time to get our feet wet. A kind of review what's out there. The main work has been in committee process. The major topic that is at the Capitol right now these days is education funding. We all know that that's a big issue. Before us, there's talk of how much, if any, and will there be a constitutional amendment to address the word suitable that seems to be getting us in trouble. I heard a pretty good explanation the other day that the word suitable has been defined by the courts to include adequate. So suitable and adequate, because if you look in our Constitution, the word adequate is not there, but it has been interpreted as such. So as legislators, we need to address this and set priorities for our state. We did have some interesting items come out of committee. There was a legislative post audit on K through 12 transportation funding. The audit reported that the Department of Education has not been following statute, and funds have not been appropriated as the legislature intended for quite a few years now, I guess since 1973. And last year it resulted in a $9 million funding to there's about 20 schools. It's changed, and that's the interesting thing. The number hasn't always been the same. It's over 20-some schools that have received more funding than they should have. And over the last 5 years, it's resulted in $45 million worth of increased funding for different transportation. Also in the audit, it was pointed out that the Kansas Department of Education wasn't always counting properly. If the student is over 2.5 miles from the school, then they're supposed to be counted if they ride the bus. And it was found out that some of the schools, or some of the Department of Education is counting the students whether they ride the bus or not. So of course there's going to be more depth and more questions asked about that legislative post audit. You know, I'm happy to deliver some good news. Senate Tax Committee, we had a couple of hearings. One of them was to talk about what has gone on with the tax bill, the retroactive tax bill that passed last year. This is not the good news. The state collected over $83 million in revenue, greater than anticipated. Well, most of that was a result of President Trump's tax cuts. I can go into the detail a little bit later, but the good news that your pocketbooks, besides the federal tax cuts, which is good news because you're going to see pay less taxes in, is the fact that the utility companies are going to see, corporations went from 31% to 23% on their income tax. So if you have your utilities from a corporation, they are going to be passing that savings on to you. It was announced in the tax committee this week. They have applied. They have to apply for rate changes to the Kansas Corporation Commission. The Kansas Corporation Commission took the incentive they knew that would be coming, and so they're trying to expedite the process as much as possible. So if you do have utilities from a co-op, though, they do not pay corporate taxes, so you will not see that difference in your utilities bill. But it's nice to pass on some good news from the Kansas legislature once in a while.
Yeah. Kevin?
Thank you very much. It's good to be here, and thank you guys for showing up today. I didn't when I opened the blinds, it was really kind of gloomy and everything, but wet, which is kind of nice considering how cold it's been and how dry it's been. So, but I didn't know how many people would show up, and so I want to thank the Farm Bureau and thank the Chamber and thank you guys for showing up. This is always good, and it's early in the legislative session, so this is a good time to ask those crystal ball questions about what do you think is going to happen and everything. So I already saw that on there, and I'm excited to give you kind of what we think is going to happen, because right now in the legislature we're really getting a lot of more informational catch up on what has happened, possibilities for what will happen. And as I've said before, a lot of rumors and drama happen early on where you don't really know. People will start asking about whether it's Medicaid expansion or other stuff. You know, we don't necessarily know. You just have indicators of what might lead to something like that, or what could influence what. So I'm going to list off a few things that I've actually been privy to the last week and a half, and then and also bring to your attention just a real quick thing for on our income taxes that we can look at, and then lastly, I just I wanted to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know, I'm Kevin Jones. I represent the 5th District, which we're not in the 5th District. It entails Wellsville, goes down below Ottawa, and gets Garnett area, and then it goes across and gets Osawatomie area, and then comes back up to Wellsville. So that's where I currently represent. With that, I'm on K through 12 Budget Committee. I'm on Higher Education Budget Committee, which I chair. I'm on the Joint Committee on Kansas Security, which I co-chair with a senator, and then I'm also on K through 12 on appropriations. So those are kind of the things that I'm more attuned to right now. It all has to do with money, K through 12 budget, higher education budget, and stuff like that. But that said, this week we heard from homeschoolers. They came up at a homeschool day. That was fantastic, good information. A lot of senators and representatives showed up, and so it was really good considering our current budget crunch and K through 12 budget funding. It was nice to hear from the homeschool families, and you can ask questions about how that came about. But then Higher Education Day was just the other day, and that was amazing. All of the colleges across Kansas and everything showed up. It was really good. Great just to be out there and talk to each of the colleges, put faces and mascots to colleges. It was fantastic. And I can speak to kind of the asks that they're asking this year with higher education and how that's impacted by the, as the senator said, the actual K through 12 funding and the judges' opinions and that. Tax refund to a specific USD. This is something that we can currently do in our income taxes. Right now, there's a little checkbox on, I think it's line 42, page 2, where you can when you're doing your individual income tax, you can actually check it if you want your refund or part of your refund to go to a specific USD, to a school district, and you can check on there and actually send money to them. So I think that's an important information to get out there, because then that can mean more money to our current USD, to our unified school districts. So that's a big deal to get out there. We had sexual harassment training this past week. Yeah. Here's some laughs about that, and I can speak more to that. I know I heard on KPR they were talking a little bit and interviewed some people, and I laughed because that same person was talking to me during it and after it, and so I have a little bit of insight there. But real big focus on transparency right now. And for full disclosure, we're talking real big on transparency, but our cameras, I guess, aren't working for like the first couple of weeks, and I'm not sure that they've gotten those back on.
In the Senate.
Were they on in the Senate? And so it's kind of spotty right now, but the idea is that everything will be live streamed, so you can, everybody can already hear it, but to actually be able to see it and everything, that's, we're working on that. We have the state of the state. We have the state of the judiciary. Lots of questions about that. Capers we had a hearing on Capers and where it currently stands, and how it looks for the future. Got an update on Osawatomie State Hospital and also Larned. And there's some similar things happening with Larned that happened with Osawatomie. So that's a heads up and something you might ask questions about. And then with the K through 12 direction and the psychologists that they're looking at, there is some questions. Yeah, well, it was something from the some people are going, "What are you talking about?" It was mentioned in the state of the state about psychologists in the K through 12 and stuff, and probably well needed with suicide and things like that. But I did some asking with our mental health centers and stuff, and the crossover is kind of difficult. Also with jobs, it could be kind of difficult. So maybe have some questions on that. But you know what? And I'll stop there. I have a few, and this is more local. I'll stop with this. I know at least 3 of my school districts are currently looking for superintendents because our current superintendents are moving on, and so it shows the need and how much we're out there, because I know that there's a huge, including my own USD 289 is looking for superintendents and looking for administrators for our K through 12. So I'll stop with that.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm kind of confused. I'm part of the 2nd Congressional District primary candidate debate today, but it's a pleasure to be here with both Senator Tyson and Representative Jones, and I kid about their other pursuits at the moment. They are both in Topeka working hard and doing their jobs for you, even as the other races go on. I want to take a moment to remember my friend Gene Ramsey as well. I had the pleasure of serving with him on the Ottawa City Commission, learned a great deal from him, and we worked together in his pursuit of getting the new Highway 59 through the years, and I was honored to stand alongside Gene and assist him as he did that. And I know we have his wife Ann here and daughter Marcy in the audience today, and want to extend our sympathies and condolences to you on the loss of Gene, and thank you for the sacrifices that you made as he served the public. Too often we forget about what spouses and families go through as their loved ones serve in the public arena, suffer the slings and sometimes arrows of criticism as they try to do what they think is right. So thank you for all that you gave up as Gene served his fellow citizens. I did tease Richard about the animal crackers. I thought since it was in honor of Gene, they would all be donkeys. But I am glad you found a couple elephants in there. Well, my colleagues have talked a lot about what's been happening in the session so far. I will tell you that it's been a pretty rapid start for some of my committees, Judiciary and Corrections. We've already heard a number of bills. We heard a bill about involuntary manslaughter, DUI, in the Corrections Committee last week. That grew out of a case where a young woman in Johnson County was hit by a drunk driver who actually had gotten into a friend's car because his had an intoxilizer, breathalyzer thing on, so he could avoid having to blow into the machine so that he could go out and drive drunk. He ended up killing her when he hit her. Also similar situation with the Johnson County deputy who was struck and killed by an intoxicated driver. So this would elevate penalties for those who drive against restrictions due to a prior DUI or who purposely try to get around one of the fail-safe systems to try to keep drunk drivers off the road. Very emotional testimony from this young lady's family. Her parents were there, as well as a friend of the family who also spoke about her and her legacy. So it was a very emotional hearing, but a very good hearing, and I think we'll see some positive legislation come out of that very soon. We also held some hearings in Judiciary, and we're going to take up a big issue next week, civil asset forfeiture, which was kind of one of the big issues at the beginning of last session. We sent it over to a group called the Judicial Council. That's a separate body that serves the judicial branch, and they kind of bring in interested parties on big topics and take a deeper dive, spend more time on them than we can in the legislature, and then come back to us with recommendations. So they have a compromise bill that we're going to hear next week. It's got agreement from law enforcement entities, from prosecutors, from the ACLU, and other civil liberties groups. And I think we'll have a good shot at trying to get that up and out of committee and hopefully considered on the floor of the House and sent over to our friends in the Senate. Obviously, K-12 funding is the big issue. That's the elephant in the room. And that's one we can talk more and unpack more, I think, through your questions than any of us talking to you about it from this standpoint. So far, the interim committee that I was a part of, they've been going around, staff's been going around giving reports to appropriations and ways and means and the various K-12 budgets and special committees on school finance. So I think that's been helpful to give a lot of legislators information that they might not have had otherwise. As Representative Jones said, we had the State of the State, and the next week we had the State of the Judiciary. This is the second year the State of the Judiciary has been back in the State House, which is appropriate to have it there, and Chief Justice came over and gave his message, and of course the week before the governor made some headlines with his message. So we can unpack all those issues this morning and talk about them, but I want to make sure we do that and give you plenty of time for your questions. So I'll stop and we'll stand by for questions, and hopefully we can get some answers for you. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you.
Okay, now it's your turn to be involved. Lewis has the mic. Who has the first question?
All right. How would you promote and support full transparency in the hopes to promote voter confidence, gut and go practices and voting records, maybe?
I can start. Transparency is very important to us in the legislature. We had a series of articles published by one newspaper in the state this year, and suddenly the state government is no longer transparent. I will tell you that some of the things that have been talked about, for example, these anonymous bills that are supposedly introduced in my committee, Judiciary, we have always noted in the minutes who introduced the bill. If they introduced it on behalf of a different group, we've noted what group they were acting on behalf of. For example, we had a representative introduce a bill on behalf of the District Judges Association. So it says Representative so-and-so introduced a bill on behalf of the District Judges Association to do whatever the bill did. And all of our minutes are approved and they are published online so that anyone with a couple of clicks on the state legislative website, which is kslegislature.org, you can go find the bill in question. You can track back through. It has the history of the bill and where it was introduced and what date. And you can click on the committee where it was introduced and find the minutes for that date, and it will tell you exactly who introduced that bill. So we are fully transparent on bill introductions in my committee. It takes 2 clicks to get there. So you have to click on the bill, and then you have to click on the committee minutes for that day. But that's the way our committee does it. There's always a record of who introduced a bill. The process of a gut and go is where the contents of a bill are removed and some other contents are put in. That is a very necessary legislative device. When we get to the end of a legislative session and there are policy pieces that maybe got through one house but didn't get all the way through the other, or they got held up. Last year we had a number of judiciary bills and the Senate President many days said she wasn't going to go on general orders, meaning she wasn't going to work bills. They were holding up waiting for some other things. And because of that, there were many bills that the House passed that the Senate got through the Judiciary Committee, but they didn't get a chance to get worked on the floor. And sometimes it happens the other way. It's not a fault of the Senate. It's just that's what happens. And when the houses meet to synthesize the different versions of bills, they have to have a mechanism to get some of that content that may not have made it all the way through and make sure that it gets made into law. So it's not about hiding the ball. It's not about keeping people from knowing what's going on. It's about trying to find a way to get that piece of legislation through both houses, because that's what it has to do. Remember the old Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law? We have to get that content through both houses. And sometimes that's the only way to do it, is to take something else that's sitting there that we're not going to deal with and put the contents into that shell and try to get it done. So I understand that does make it harder to follow, particularly at the end of the session. It makes it hard to follow. It's hard for legislators to keep up with all of it. But all of those conference committee reports are online. And there are rules in both House and Senate on how quickly we can act on some of those things so that they can be published, so that people can find out what's going on with them. And again, I strongly encourage people to use the website, and you'll see it's very robust in terms of bill tracking, bill history, what's gone on with different bills, so that you can stay on top of it. Also encourage you to look at Twitter. You don't have to tweet, you don't have to be part of all that, but you can track, and the hashtag KSLeg hashtag, there's a lot of the reporters, a lot of the media types put on there. They'll sit in committees and they'll kind of live tweet and talk about what's going on in committees. Many of them are also live streamed on the internet. My committee, Judiciary, was one of the first to be live streamed. I think almost all of them now are live streamed on the internet. And this year we will have video streaming of both House and Senate chambers for people to look at. Right now you can go to YouTube because the House camera has been down, but you can go to YouTube and there's a YouTube channel for the Kansas House, and we're broadcasting that way, somewhat like the City Commission here does with Facebook Live, so you can follow along there. And I encourage anybody here, if you ever have a question about an issue that's important to you, or you say, what's going on with this bill, my email and phone number are available. I know the Senator and Representative Jones's are also available. We encourage people to call or email us with a question. Can you tell me where this bill is at? I get several of those throughout the session when people say, I'm interested in this piece of legislation, can you tell me where it's at? And I always respond to them and try to give them a link to the website so they can track it too and see where it's going. So I think some of this has been sensationalized by the media. I think there's still things we can do better, but I would disagree with the notion that Kansas is dark or hiding things, or that legislators go out of their way to be anything other than transparent with their constituents, at least the ones that I know and the ones here before you.
The representative is correct, and I'll also add to that, there's seems to be one or two gubernatorial candidates that are trying to campaign on this, saying that we're not transparent. Also, I would say that they don't understand the process and understand where to look. Yes, could we make it easier to find? That's not the legislative. We do not have oversight of the website because, believe me, I would change the user interface. I'm a software developer, and it's not the most intuitive website to use. But you can search for bills, you can search for language, the status. My committee also, the minutes, they're open to the public. The attachments that individuals bring in for distribution in the committee are included in the minutes. Also, the introductions, the motions, who make the motions, the bill introductions, it's all included in the minutes. It is completely transparent. Like I said, it's difficult to find and it takes some effort, but it is there. Also, as far as the gut and goes go, I agree that it can be a necessary tool. We have come to the point where we're almost abusive of some of these situations. It's like you have the one bad student that abuses the freedom in the classroom, and so all of the students get punished. And I hope that's not what happens. I hope we can curb in the abusers of those types of situations. We had, in 2016, I was on Ways and Means in the Senate, and there was a bill that had been posted since almost the beginning of session. And about 2 months into session, the chairman decided to have a hearing on the bill, and he announced it. It was announced 2 weeks prior. We got to, for some reason, there was Facebook, Twitter was just running rampant, saying how a secret K through 12 funding bill was going to be discussed on X date, and it was anything but secret. The news media, I'd never seen so much coverage in one committee room. There was TV stations from all over the state, radio stations. The room was packed. You couldn't even get in it. And what was interesting was my intern at the time had witnessed all this and responded to one of the comments on the internet saying how secretive it was, and she said, no, it was completely transparent. And the response back was, well, if that's what you want to believe. I mean, this is from somebody that witnessed it, and then, so it's difficult to understand the process. It's not very simple, but we do encourage you to be involved. Reach out to our office. We're more than glad to help you through that legislative process. That's one of the things that I do enjoy about being a legislator, is helping my constituents through the bureaucratic process and to help get solutions and to find out what's going on in the legislature.
I appreciate the question, and I think it's all of our intention and within government to be completely transparent, or as much as possible. Now that makes it sound like there's stuff that's hidden. I can give you a couple of where it's come to head with myself. For instance, I had a bill a few years ago that I had worked on, figured out, and it had to do with conceal and carry for active duty military, just getting it done quickly. And so when I was getting ready to introduce the bill, I was like, okay, how do I go about doing this? Most people, and I'm not afraid of it at all, but most people go up and they get it introduced in their own name, maybe get some other co-sponsors and that kind of stuff. I was like, well, our Military Veteran Homeland Security Committee, we weren't doing anything, and I was like, well, I'll just introduce it in here. So when it was introduced, it went through committee, and my name was not attached to it at all. So I get no I get no recognition for it personally or politically. You know what I mean? And that's fine with me. But it went through in kind of a weird way, but it did actually become law, and I'm very grateful for that. But that's just one way, transparency-wise. Like, you can actually get something through and your name's not on it at all, you know. But I don't think most people do that. I think most people would say, yeah, I voted this way, I didn't vote that way, introduced this bill, whatever. But those things can happen if you're trying to sneak a way through, or if you literally think that's the easiest or the best way to get it through. That might happen. There was another bill that I introduced that I did not agree with. And that bill was brought by a constituent, and they wanted it over a couple of years, so we worked on it, and I introduced that. When I introduced it, it was in my name, but there's a way that I don't remember the actual title of it, where you introduce it, and it's like introduced by Kevin Jones, but he's not necessarily for this thing, And that was a bill that it actually went to committee, and they worked it out. Well, I think that's also an important thing, to where it might not be something that I personally agree with, but that constituent and in their area might have really needed that bill. And so, in all transparency, we got a bill that came through, and I don't know that it even passed that year. I think it maybe passed the next year, but the whole point to it was that I'm doing something I don't necessarily agree with, but if the state and the area and local government feel like this is the right thing to do, then good for us, And so that's kind of one of those humbling things. I think the biggest issue with the transparency is the recorded votes in committee, where you're working the committee process. And I mean, there's been times that only myself and one other person on the committee, he made the motion and I made the second, and we're the only ones who voted for something, That's where, they were like, well, how did you vote in committee or whatever? That's where maybe the transparency people kind of go, I don't know.
Is that in the minutes?
It can be recorded in the minutes. Good question. It can be recorded in the minutes. If I vote a certain way on something, and this happens many, many times in appropriations, they'll ask, Mr. Chair, will you please record my vote? But it only records the vote of whoever says, will you record my vote? In that case. So I know there's been legislators in the past or committee chairmen in the past who record every vote. And I think there's maybe a bill that is looking at recording all of those votes. But when you're talking about those kind of things, I know the last school funding formula, K-12 funding formula that was unconstitutional, was passed out without recommendation, which means there was no vote when it was passed out of committee to the larger committee. Sometimes that's important because that bill might have never gotten out of committee.
Another question?
I may be excused for not standing. There's, well, even back to 2 or 3 years ago, there was a lot of talk about farmers not paying enough taxes on their land, et cetera. That particular legislator is no longer representing Mission Hills, but what's the scuttlebutt around now? Who are you trying to tax as far as agriculture is concerned? I seem to be about one of 2 or 3 here for agriculture. But, in light of low commodity prices, high expenses of putting crops in and so forth, now's not the time. So what's surfacing up there?
I can speak just a tad to that. Leave it to government, especially government that needs money. Wait, I guess they all need money. Government that's looking for money and stuff right now, and it hits close to home for me, is the internet sales tax, or just taxing sales on the internet, and looking for some, and that is probably 2 or 3 years out when it comes to that. I was thinking about this the other day, and I do online sales. It's how we eat, and I know Amazon and some other companies are already paying those taxes and doing those type of things. But as government is looking for a way to fairness or taxing that entity, man, I would love to see us remove from our own property taxes, take away from taxes we're already paying if we're going to start taxing over here. Things that I would consider not necessarily constitutional. To actually, if you're gonna tax over here, let's take it off of over here. But in the way of ag taxes, I haven't heard much of anything.
I wish I could say the same. That's not accurate. The gentleman that you are referring to left an appetite in the legislature to increase taxes on. He stoked the fire. And I had that comment made to me this week. We had a gentleman on the Senate Tax Committee who his personal taxes, he has ag land, and the county that he lives in reclassified it as to residential land. We have, yes, we have statutes that protect against that, but the classification was done, and he is contesting it. So we're going to have some hearings in the Senate Tax Committee as to what's going on with our classifications, our appraisals, and to take a closer look at it. We'll also be revisiting the property tax cap. There's just so many issues before us. The other item that I touched on a little bit, but the federal tax law that passed in 2017 impacted our state income taxes. There's a couple of ways it did. One was individuals, there's about 20% of Kansans that itemize on their income tax. The standard deduction was increased so high at the federal level, it was almost doubled, that a majority of people will not be itemizing at the federal. Well, I shouldn't say a majority, but many who did itemize may not need to now. So that could be an unintended tax increase on Kansans who will not be able to itemize because they do not itemize at the federal level. So we're going to have to take a look at how it impacts. Utilities was one example. The federal legislation impacted our state, businesses in our state, in a very positive manner, but we have to look at how that's going to impact our state revenues and impact us going forward. So the Senate Tax Committee will be looking at that. I've already talked to the House Chairman of Tax. We'll be working together on this issue to try and figure out where we need to be as a state. What was really disappointing was in the Tax Interim Committee this year, that's a committee that was off session, the majority leader from the House testified that the ag use rolling, the 8-year rolling average needs to be decreased. It was an eye-opener that most of us didn't expect to have stated from the majority leader, him understanding the equation as he does. But we will be taking a look. I don't think that will come up for debate. It would be very dangerous for us to, as you know, that 8-year moving average. Right now, agriculture prices, we are paying taxes based off of an 8-year rolling average. Well, in the past, ag prices have been fairly good for a couple of years. Now, prices have come down, we're depressed, and what doesn't get put into that equation is the input cost for agriculture. We're paying input costs as for 2018 prices when commodity prices are about in the 1980s. Agriculture is huge to Kansas. It's a $10.2 billion industry. It impacts thousands of jobs throughout the state, maybe not directly, but indirectly. It's an industry that we need to protect. I don't need to tell, we understand how important it is here in this area, but you know, sometimes our friends to the northeast of us forget a little bit, and we need to remind our legislative friends that their food does come from another place other than the grocery store.
I think it would be unlikely to see changes this year. I think most of the legislators, Alameda, are not interested in tax increases this year for the obvious reason it's an election year. There was a tax increase passed last year. I do think the notion of changing in some way the ag use value formula will be on the table in future years. We're seeing an increasing number of Western Kansas representatives talk about either ag use value calculation changes like what the senator mentioned, or even just raising property taxes to fund schools. You'll recall that the state mill levy for schools used to be about 35 mills, and it was lowered through the 1990s when the state had generally surpluses and the economy was strong. And now there's talk about, it was reduced from 35 down to 20, and now there's talk about taking it back up to 30 or 35 in order to fund some of the Gannon cases, mandates regarding school funding. So that suggestion was kind of spoken with some approval by Western Kansas representatives, which surprised me, quite frankly, because typically they're on the other end of lower property taxes and trying to keep ag use values as low as possible because of the size of the acreages out there and obviously the toll that it takes on agriculture. We're going to redistrict in 2022, and you're going to see more Johnson County, more Sedgwick County, more Shawnee County representation, and less in the rural areas throughout the state. And so I don't think this is going to go away, and I think it's going to be pretty incumbent on those of us who depend on agriculture for our local economies to be engaged in the process and pushing back on those notions of increasing the load on farmers to try to pay that tax burden.
Will 3 counties or 4 make the laws then?
It'll be darn close. I mean, and this is rural depopulation. This is what's going to happen.
Yeah, if I may add to that, you've heard me talk about before, out of 125 House members, 25 of them touch Johnson County. Out of 40 senators, 8 touch Johnson County. 20 of them are from the 5 largest populated counties in the state. So redistricting is an issue. I'd like to bring to your attention, I've been talking about it for years, our U.S. Congress, I hope they address this before the next redistricting. We count residents, not citizenship. So we are losing representation based off of that. So even if you're in the United States on a legal visa, or if you're here illegally, that is counted as a resident. And so Kansas used to have 7 congressional seats. We're on the verge. We think that we'll be able to retain the 4 that we have now, but we could lose a congressional seat. And with our state representation, we know that Johnson County and other areas that are growing much faster than our rural, because most of our rural areas are stagnant, we'll lose representation if we continue to count residency and not citizenship. So we need to address that.
Another question?
It's hard for me not to hold a microphone, but so thank you for your time today, and thank you for your public service. The State Board of Education recently announced some pretty progressive goals for education, and the governor supported those goals. They included 95% graduation rate, adding 150 school counselors, social workers, and school psychologists over the next 5 years. Also allowing for 15 college credit hours for every kid who graduates from high school in Kansas. And probably most important in my estimation, and that is raising teacher salaries. Right now in our area, we rank 4th out of 5 states. So I guess I'd just like to hear your philosophical support of those goals, as well as how you feel about the financial support.
Karen, you want to lead off?
Sure, gladly. You know, it was interesting when the governor gave the State of the State, he announced a $600 million increase over 5 years to K through 12, and he announced the 150 counselors, and the room was silent. There wasn't a comment or an applaud from either side of the chamber, which was interesting, and because it caught all of us off guard. Knowing the situation that we're in and then the increases that K through 12 has seen in the past few years. In 2010 and 2011, or 2009, 2010, K through 12 saw the largest cuts, and that was before any of us were in the legislature. Since then, there's been an attempt to catch up on those cuts, and I had a graph out in my legislative update that showed the incline has been up. K through 12 overall funding has not been cut since the governor took office, since I took office, but what has happened is the equation for different school districts, local districts, may not have seen an increase. They may have seen a decrease because of how the equation works. But the overall funding was, it was stagnant 1 year, but it was not a decrease from the previous year's number. What happened in 2015 was we passed a $130-some million increase to K through 12 funding. And when we left, the legislature left after we passed that increase, Kansas Department of Education told the schools they were going to get a $190 million increase. So we came back in January, the legislature, and the money wasn't there. So we had to decrease the increase that they were told. That created a lot of animosity, but what it did was I went out and reached out to superintendents in schools throughout the district to explain what went on, because they were put in a bad situation. They were told they were going to get more money than they actually received, and they had budgeted based off the larger amount, which was difficult for them. But it was difficult for the legislature also, because we had only passed the 130-some amount, and we were supposed to scramble to come up with the difference. So I opened communication lines with the schools, and what it did was, the result of it was created an awareness of the needs of both the legislature and the schools. We need those communication lines. And as a result, we had school districts, over 5 school districts reached out to myself and Representative Jones and other legislators in that area, and had a meeting this year to actually discuss the priorities of the state and our area, which I would love to have that discussion here too. You know, how much is enough? Are we squeezing our citizens? The money's not getting to the classroom. The Senate tried to pass legislation last year that would have required 65% of the K through 12 funding go to the classroom and the teachers. We could not get that passed. The money, the decisions for the money there are some restrictions, but for overall, it's the local school boards and the superintendent. The superintendent presents the budget to the school board, and the school board decides on where those funds are distributed to. The block grant a couple of years ago, I know there was animosity and angst over it, but we've had so many superintendents come to us now and ask that they get a similar type equation. They realize that it did free up the money and that they weren't as restricted. Another thing a school district can do, and I encourage them to do it, is to apply to be an innovative school district. An innovative school district removes some of the legislative restrictions and allows them the freedom in the classroom and allows the teachers to teach. One of the largest things, when I was in high school, our local math teacher, he gave us equations that applied to our lives. And so it sparked an interest for most of us in math. I think if we let the teachers, instead of trying to go to Common Core and other programs that one size fits all, in Kansas, our state school board is trying to address this by having programs for each individual student and to address the student's needs. And that's what we need to do as a state. We need to have the tough discussion of where is the money going? Is it a brand new, gorgeous building, or is it getting to the classroom and the teachers where it needs?
I'll try. I appreciate your question, Superintendent, and I will do my best to be there philosophically, do some philosophical on that. I heard in your question also the passion with which you want to serve the teacher, you want to serve the students. We want to not just do a suitable, we want to do an excellent education. That's the desire. Hearing from colleges and hearing from K through 12 and hearing from parents who are dealing with remediation and things like that, we want the best education for our children as they move on. So when it comes to what the psychologist that the governor, when the senator is right, when he started talking about some of the stuff, and we're looking at the money that we need, the money that's kind of being demanded from the legislature who holds the purse strings, that's when we're going, okay, how are we supposed to do that? And now we had to take in mind or understand that he's placing a vision out there. And so some of us expected him to be more pragmatic, but then he said, this is what I believe it's what he really wants. He wants to do the $600 million for the schools. He wants to have the psychologists in the schools. He wants to be able to do these things. And so then it hit some of us sideways. We're going, okay, how are we supposed to do that? And so with the psychology, I know personally for USD 289, I say personally, not the whole board, but for Wellsville School District, our priority was a curriculum director, not necessarily a psychologist yet. And so that's the direction that we've moved. I also know when it comes to teacher pay and when it comes to pay across the board, whether it's administrators, teachers, or classified, unclassified, all that stuff, that ultimately we could dump a bunch of money on the school, and then the school board's going to say, well, and then they're going to go to the teachers and they're going to negotiate, and they might get a bump, they might not. That really is up to that local district, and I know for our school board, we're going to be making those negotiations to make that decision. So just dumping the money and expecting it to get to where it's supposed to be, that really comes down to that local governance too. And so that's something that the governor didn't really or say, and so philosophical, I agree with you. And my biggest concern, and this goes to the interim committee that Representative Finch was on, is ultimately the question of the constitutional part of that, and just how much money is not necessarily demanded to meet suitable. So.
Philosophically, yes, these are wonderful goals. I was a product of Ottawa's public schools. I took a class called economics with a teacher named Chris Kornhaus, and one of Chris's overriding principles is that economics is the study of how people deal with scarcity. That is unlimited wants and scarce resources, and these are wonderful goals philosophically to achieve. Hundreds of social workers and school psychologists and $600 million into the education system. The practical reality is when we talk about what are the resources actually available. Part of the interim committee, we looked at the state budget going forward. When the legislature takes its seats in January of 2019, they will face a budget that is $500 million underwater for that 2 years before we ever spend another dollar on K-12 education. That $500 million is not a one-time cut. It's an ongoing cut, meaning you have to eliminate it and keep eliminating it forever in the budget. And so you're going to reduce programming, you're going to lay people off, you're not going to fill positions. If you add the $600 million on top of that, you're looking at $1.1 billion that would have to be raised by that legislature that sits in those seats in January of 2019. Remember that two of our funding streams, property taxes and income taxes, are actually paid in arrears. So if you want money in that 2-year budget cycle, the tax increases would have to take place almost immediately in order to avoid the retroactivity issue that came up last time. And so that is a tall lift for a new legislature to come in and address those things. I would favor, instead of putting more social workers in schools, I would favor utilizing community mental health centers who are hurting for funding and adding more social workers there and letting them do a model similar to what we do with school resource officers, where we have police officers that are retained by the police department but serve students as the bulk of their 40-hour-a-week commitment in the school district. I'd rather see something similar with social workers and mental health professionals so that we get the services into the schools, but that we prop up these entities and organizations that are not just helping school kids, but helping all of the people around them as well. It's great to think about 95% graduation rates, and Kansas has an 84-point-something% graduation rate. We're no slouches. We're 4% above the national average already. But we don't get there unless we fix some of the problems that these kids face outside the school building. And I think it is naive for us to continue to talk about K-12 funding and ignore all of the other needs that exist around these children in their day-to-day lives. You can't take them from 7:30 to 3:30 and ignore the reality of what they go home to. And we can't take them for 8-9 months out of the year and drop them off over the summer and give them 3 months of no intellectual stimulation, no teaching, no education, and expect they're going to show up in August and be ready to roll. We have to look at holistic changes to our system, and we have to look at the whole bevy of wraparound services that young people need. And I don't think it's enough to just say we're going to put money into this and not look at all these other things. And that does not mean that I think we should shortchange education. Not at all. I think teachers are underpaid oftentimes. I think if you look at the United States versus other countries and what they spend on teachers, there's a new study out from an international group that says American teachers are about 60 cents on the dollar in an international comparison. We want some of the best and brightest and most committed young people to get out of college and say, I want to go be a teacher. I want to touch the minds of these young children. I want to help them and expand their intellectual curiosity about the world. I talked about Chris Kornhaus. Chris Kornhaus could be rough around the edges, but he would challenge students to think about things in a way they hadn't before. Candy Campbell is here today. Gloria Cruz is here. Linda Alderman, all teachers that either I had or my daughter had who helped her, who opened her mind and expanded her world, and mine too, and that is what we need. We need those kinds of people going into the field, and that's going to require fair compensation. But it's not enough to simply put money out there. We've got to look at, are we allowing districts to spend it effectively? And are we setting up a formula that works for our schools and for their students? And I'll tell you that I think we missed a golden opportunity. The whole point of the block grants was to take 2 years to sit down and pull people together and talk about what the formula should be, and that didn't happen. And it was rumored that the governor went to people after his speech and said, this was the speech I wish I could have given my first year. Well, Governor, you could have given it your first year. And you could have been the one that took the lead and said, let's spend these 2 years talking really about designing a formula that works, and let's find a way to get off this stupid cycle of litigation about school funding. It is ridiculous that my daughter, who is 17 years old, has faced the threat of school closures twice in her academic career. And I believe we have an opportunity this session to engage in a conversation about how we get off of that cycle and do something different, and we should. And if the legislature shirks its responsibility and doesn't have that conversation, then shame on every member in it. And that includes talking about litigation itself and talking about the Constitution and not removing the court from its appointed role, not gutting the constitutional requirement to educate children, but saying, are there better ways to resolve the conflict than what we have now? Are there better ways that we can serve our kids so that they don't see the adults in the room talking about closing their schools and constitutional crisis and standing up to this branch or that branch, but instead say, wait a minute, we can do this better. Let's talk about and figure out how to do it. And so I call on everybody in the K-12 community and all of the other various agencies of the state, mental health and transportation, all of them, say, let's get to the table, let's work together, and let's figure this out. Because it is a zero-sum game. We have a finite amount of dollars. Let's figure out how we can best serve all of the citizens in our state and not resort to litigation to come up with the answer.
Okay, I'm not sure if I should say amen after that or not. But, then we got time for one more brief question.
Okay, this is actually just really probably more for Blaine. Do you think you will be able to resist the Koch brothers' political arm twisting, given their heavy-handed use of their Americans for Prosperity PAC to attack you for helping to defeat the Brownback state financing disaster?
Well, I have, and I think my colleagues, every day I go to the State House, I try to do what I think is best for the district. That's not always popular. That's not always what people want to hear. We had a long conversation about Medicaid expansion last session, and I had friends who had been with me all along who suddenly said I was a turncoat because I came to a different conclusion after looking at the facts. But the Koch brothers have never been one of those people who have supported me. AFP has been a constant critic of mine in the whole time that I've been in the legislature, and that's been okay because the people who count, they go to the polls every 2 years and they keep sending me back. So until they don't, I'm going to take it as a sign that they want me there and they want me to continue to try to do what I've been doing. I don't always get it right. I don't have all the right answers. None of us do. We get it wrong. We're people just like everyone else. But we look at the facts, we look at the evidence, and we try to come to the best conclusion, and I'm going to keep doing that regardless of how many postcards land in your mailbox or mine. And I thank you all sincerely from the bottom of my heart for the opportunity to go and represent you. Even when we disagree, I thank you for the chance to be your representative in Topeka.
You know, I'll finish up on that too real quick. I I do not belong to any organizations or caucus with any of the groups up there other than the Republican caucus. I am dedicated to my constituents, and that's what we need. We need representation that will go to Topeka and stand for our districts. We've got so many, we need to have the tough conversation. We've got school funding, we've got Osawatomie Hospital that is long overdue for remodel or new buildings. We've got the prisons that are in detrimental shape, our law enforcement. We've got highways and infrastructure that need addressed. And we need, again, to come together, have the conversations, decide our priorities as a state, and to work this out. And understand that when we increase our taxes, we impact people's livelihoods and their pocketbooks. And on the flip side, we do need the taxes, the tax money to operate and to support our infrastructure. So it is an extreme balancing act, and we must keep our constituency in mind when we make those decisions and how we will impact the state of Kansas. Thank you again for coming, and thank you for sponsoring this morning's coffee.
As we close, we want to thank Ann for coming, and Blaine's so right that sometimes we fail to recognize there's another person in our lives or others in our lives that make sacrifices so we can do the things that we're passionate about. There are animal crackers back there. There's more than elephants and donkeys. And there's giraffes and some zebras, and I think there's a lion back there. I want to thank Matt with the city that is filming this. It'll be replayed several times during the course of the week, so you can tune in and assess what was said this morning. We thank you for your participation, but we thank our legislators for taking the time, and it doesn't happen in all counties across the state. I'm familiar with some. They don't have any legislative coffees. And we have once a month an opportunity, and they come down and they answer the hard questions. They don't shrink away. We may not always agree, but they're to find out where we're standing on the issues, and we know where they're coming from, and I think that's healthy for both sides. John, where's John? When is the next month?
February 17th.
February 17th, 10 o'clock, same place. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Robin.